Hello listeners and welcome to the show. This is Sam Abrika, the CEO of Nova Money, an AI financial planner designed to help you build financial freedom. In this episode, Dr. Howard will explain us in very simple terms how our mind works and how it can easily be manipulated to spend money on false promises. Dr. Howard Rankin has a lifelong career as a clinical psychologist, researcher, writer, and professor at the University of Oxford. In his latest book, I Think Therefore I Am Wrong, Dr. Rankin explains why our society is prone to fake news, political correctness, and what it implies for the future of mankind. Hello Howard and welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you today.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
And the reason I'm excited is we often talk about finance as if it was purely a numerical aspect, a quantitative discipline. But I think one aspect very often overlooked is a psychological dimension of how people deal with their money, how their mind is working, or the cognitive biases that we have, because that's how we drive all our decisions.
Correct. And there is this ironically false assumption that we're all rational and logical, or that there is only a rational, logical way of looking at it. And when it comes to numbers, it should be simple, but unfortunately, that's flawed. It doesn't work that way, and we'll get into that. But certainly in the last 10 years, really, there's been a lot more interest in the whole concept of cognitive bias. And what is cognitive bias? Biases are things that mislead you or guide your thinking based on a variety of factors, your experiences, all sorts of things about you. And now we've identified, dozens and dozens of biases that we use really to justify what we want to think and do. And so I think it's actually more helpful not to think as human beings as totally rational. They're not. They're really storytellers looking for evidence to justify their belief. Or we're talking about money, their purchase or how they use their money.
One of the things I often wondered is how come finance is often associated to the numerical aspect and so little with the psychological aspect?
Well, that's true. And of course, anything involving human beings is going to have a psychological aspect. But actually, even at the numerical aspect, I think that there's a lot lacking. In the US, there are quite a few very smart people in the subject of numeracy, but there's also a lot of not very smart people, and the US comes out pretty low in overall numeracy. And one of the big things about money that I think most people do not get is the whole issue of compounding. They don't understand compounding, right? I hate to bring up the virus, but I think that was one of the issues. People do not understand compounding. They do not understand that I could give one person this thing, and then they could give it to 3 other people, and then those 3 people could give it. And before you've gone through a number of levels, I've given that to 2,000 people. People just don't understand that. They just don't. And money is about compounding. Where you put your money today, if you saved your money, what would it be worth in 10 years' time? If you saved £1 or $1 a day, put it in a fund that gave you 5% a year, what's that going to be worth in 5 years, 10 years? I don't think people understand that, and it's certainly not top of their mind when they're making decisions about money.
I think one of the hard parts in understanding compounding is it defies our sense of intuitions that we have about numbers and the dynamic of compounding. Because our intuition is quite good to understand linear process. So for example, I run 2 times faster, I will go 2 times longer in terms of distance. But all the processes about money compounding, investment, interest are not linear. So if you double the interest rate, you're not going to pay twice more. You're going to pay much, much more, way beyond what intuition can tell you. And actually, there is a function for that. It's called the exponential. So for all people who love the math and the complicated functions, compounding for them is just like one function to draw. And the magic is when you draw an exponential, you see that it starts to increase, and then after a certain point, it just increasingly goes like out of control.
Yeah, and one of the best ones, I think I've got this right. Sometimes I always confuse it because even knowing the answer, it stuns me. But the question is, I will give you $3 million today, or I'll give you a penny today, then I'll double that every day for 31 days. What will you take?
I think I'll take the latter.
Yeah, comes to $5 million, over $5 million. And, that's just simply mind-boggling if you say that. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about simply not understanding, as you say, geometric rather than linear progression. And when you're talking about your money, that's exactly what, at a numerical, rational point of view, we're talking about. I'm stunned this isn't really taught in schools. There would be I came up with a very easy way of doing it. You give half the class 1 week of doubling, and then you give the other half of the class 2 weeks of doubling. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the kids who've waited 2 weeks instead of 1 have like 3 times the amount of the kids who had 1 week. Show them, teach them. Don't do it. Unfortunately, I don't want to get off on education, but don't do things just intellectually. If you're going to teach somebody something, you've got to do it more than intellectually. You've got to have them experience it in some way. And so this is a problem because there are a lot of important life lessons like compounding that are sort of left at an intellectual level for the nerds who like science. But it's applicable to everybody.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about money. So that's just the rational thing. Before we get on to the quotation mark irrational cognitive biases, and there are many of these things that influence us in our thinking generally, and also about money. So there are things like confirmation bias. So we make a decision, we buy a car, right? And then we look for all the evidence that shows that we were right in our decision. We see all the other cars on the road that are just like the ones we bought and all of this stuff. That's called confirmation bias. We don't like discomfort. We go out and prove to ourselves we were right. Now that also has implications on purchasing and money. But confirmation bias is one of them, and one of the things that social media really has accelerated and amplified. Because in social media, you can connect with so many people, you are bound to find people who agree with you. Secondly, because of the way technology works and making sure you see stuff that you want to see, you're going to be presented with things that confirm your views. You're not going to be presented as much with things that don't confirm your views. So confirmation bias is a big one. Another one is availability. You might see the same story 6 times in different media platforms. Oh my gosh, yeah, this is important. No, it's just one source of information, which may or may not be correct. But because it's available to you, because it's top of your mind, it has more salience and influences you more. One area where this gets in is in disputes. Think of a dispute between a husband and wife. One of them does something stupid, the other person gets angry. And the other person gets angry in response to their anger, and now we're in a cycle of anger. And of course, when you're in anger, you think of all the stupid things that the other person's done. And before long, all your mind is full of what's available in your mind is all the negatives about that person, if you're not careful, right? And you can see how that gets out of control. So again, we have to be careful about what are we paying attention to? Are we over-focusing on certain things, etc., etc.? And then once you've made up your mind or Then you look for confirmation bias to justify it, and down the rabbit hole we go.
I think it's very important what you just said, because in today's society, the whole ecosystem wants us to believe that our sole purpose is to buy stuff. And I see so many people, their only preoccupation in life is, oh, I want this, what can I buy, what can I do with my money? And that's their top of mind. And it creates this vicious circle that people, they want more than what they can afford, not because they really need it, not because it originates from them, but because they're just like the result of all the stimuli and all of the external social pressure that you need to think about what you're going to buy.
That's exactly right. And of course, marketers have learned the tools to drive people to that state, And as an expert in communication, those tools have really been hijacked. It's not really the tools' fault. You can use some of those tools, to save somebody's life or to rip them off. It's the intent to use them, and clearly marketers' intent is get you to buy a product and to convince you need to buy a product. And that's something that we need to be very careful about, because, the issue can be presented to you as, well, you can buy, you could buy this car or you could buy that car. Now, once you're into that discussion, there's a third alternative that's lost, which is you don't have to buy any car. Right? Right? But once you get into, well, should I get this or should I get that? That's taken out of the equation. Now you're stuck in that mindset, I'm going to buy something.
Why do you think the third option of just keeping the way things are is not even part of the equation anymore?
Well, we certainly live in a world and in a society where the notion of you've got to get more and more things, you've got to be better and better. Now, ironically, all the wise people of the past would say if you want to get better and better, you get rid of possessions, you don't accumulate them.
Exactly.
Right?
What you own owns you.
Right, exactly. And, and certainly once you get into that mindset, you never have enough money. You never have enough. You might be poor, you win the lottery, you got $15 million. Oh, that's awesome. You get used to that lifestyle, and now that's not enough, apart from the fact you spend it all. Now what you going to do?
I think it's something we should really insist on, because a lot of people believe that their problem is they just don't have enough money, and the day they will earn more, all the problems will be solved. But we had in this podcast professional football player. He made decent money. He was broke.
Mm-hmm.
I think the stats in the US, they're just unbelievable. More than 80% of the professional football players, athlete who earned millions, so more than a lifetime of everyday people learning, they are broke, like properly broke, bankrupt, zero, negative amount. And they're the biggest, highest earner in the country.
Absolutely. And one of the things for pro athletes is, they get into that, certainly even in, soccer, which would be the equivalent in Europe and around the world in terms of high payment. In this country, those kids are destined to be rich, when they're 17, 18, 19, they're stars and what have you. That's what they're thinking of. And, they just haven't learnt, they don't have the wisdom to tell that money absolutely does not buy happiness. Might give you financial relief, but financial relief is financial relief. It is not happiness. And this is a big, big mistake. I mean, people who win, there's lots of stories of people who win big amounts on lotteries. A few years later, they're destitute, they're suicidal, they're broke, they're all of those things. And the evidence around the world is, on studies on happiness, is over and above a certain amount of money, about $70,000 US, approximately, money does not add anything to happiness. Does not add. Now, it's interesting. So that's been the conventional wisdom for the last few years on studies in happiness. And there's a group at Harvard and said, well, wait a minute, perhaps this sampling of people doesn't include enough people who actually are rich. Perhaps we need to look at those. And so they looked at people who had $1 million and compared them to a group who had 10 million or more dollars. And indeed, what they found was people who had $10 million or more did seem to be happier for one reason. They felt good by giving money away to causes and charities and things that were important to them. So it wasn't the money per se, it was what allowed them to do that made them fulfilled or feel a purpose. I think that's interesting.
I like the stats you used because I read another study, I think it's from Harvard or I don't know which university. Basically, it said that there is a diminishing return above earning 4K per month, at which people are not happier. And then after a certain threshold, people will get actually less happy because more stress, more responsibilities, and they start to enter another game.
Yep, I think that's right. And we all ideally, and this is tough in a world, especially in the US, but I'm sure pretty much everywhere, where we're being bombarded with the notion that possessions and money are it. That's what it's all about. And it isn't. It isn't. There's enough studies, not just from studies on happiness, look at studies on people who are at the end of their lives. You know, what has been important to them at the end of their lives? How much money they have? No. How many hours they work, years and work? No. What was important to them at their end of their lives typically are their relationships and whether they lived the life they wanted to live, to be who they wanted to be. And I think that's very, very significant.
I can talk about that because I used to be broke most of my life until I started to work and get promoted. And during the entire time, I was obsessed with money because I thought money was the reason I couldn't be happy in life and I just need to earn more to be more satisfied. Unfortunately, it's only once you reach the point of having more money, earning more, then you realize, oh, then you didn't bring the answer. What do I do now?
Right. And it's clearly important that finding meaning, purpose, using your skills, talent, whatever special skills, talents you have, whatever they are, and some of those aren't recognized in sort of conventional culture. And I've worked with kids who, in terms of conventional education, which is really about verbal memory, can you remember facts so you can reproduce them in an exam? I mean, I was really good at that, so I was good at school, but I've seen kids who thought they were dumb, but they were actually genius working with their hands. That's their skill. That's their talent. Oh my gosh, awesome. Go into the world, manifest that. Bring it on. I think that's important for us to understand that we all have something like that we can contribute. And when you contribute, that's when you feel you have purpose. And when you feel purposeful, that is happy. And, happiness isn't something that you pursue. It's something you manifest.
I think we all have this desire to become better over time throughout our life. But there is this narrative that to be better, you need to buy more to be more. And from my perspective, I think a lot of people are going into this path because it's much more direct, it's presented to them, and it's much simpler than wondering what would make me happy in life, which is a very hard question. And nobody explained us how to answer this question.
I agree. And part of it is appreciation of, as I say, of yourself and your skills. And it may take a while to, that's not going to come instantly. That isn't going to come, it's going to take time. And that's fine. That's a journey. That's a journey that you're on. And that's an awesome journey. And to allow yourself to do that without being burdened with materialism and the sense that you've got to make a lot of money. You've got to make money, and then you can buy a lot of things that as you get older you throw away because you don't want them anymore. It's crazy. But you have to go through that perhaps to learn that.
I had to go through that personally.
Yeah, there you go. I personally do not like the... H.G. Wells said advertising is legalized lying. And he's right. He's right. Some countries are much more lenient in what people can say in an advertisement and how they can mislead you than others. In the U.S., you can say practically anything you want in an advertisement and also be a lot more subtle than that in literally brainwashing people. And to me, that's unacceptable. But it's a problem in the U.S., for sure. We have drug advertisements for, first of all, should drug marketers be able to market direct to consumer? Shouldn't there be some sort of medical intervention there? But you see these drugs for all sorts of things where people who are taking the drugs, smiling and the soft music is playing and these lovely images, and then they have to say what the side effects are. But side effects are things like, well, you could have nausea, you could be throwing up, you might die. But even as they're doing this, then all these lovely images, and the brain's going to take the images, I've always thought about making an ad where you actually show the side effects. So if the side effect is you might die, have somebody being buried. Or if the side effect is, you might be throwing up, you have show somebody throwing up in the toilet, That's an example of manipulation and brainwashing people.
In your experience, do people trust advertising and their messages?
Even when people don't, even when rationally they don't, they're still influenced. So, for example,
Wow.
Well, let me give you this example. How many of you have seen an ad that says, usual price £299, but today you can get it just for £49? Do people really think it was $299? Or just for today it's $49? I mean, do they really
Like
think
Friday.
that's a deal? Not sure. Some people are going to be influenced that because here's another bias. It's called the anchoring bias. And the anchoring bias is, if you think of a negotiation, the first number mentioned in a negotiation anchors the negotiation, right? So if I say, well, this is normally $179, that's anchored it to $179, even if I've just pulled that out of air and it makes no sense. Now, okay, we know that $179 is the anchor. Now we'll try and negotiate around that. But why? I'll tell you the story. I was in India, a country that I toured a long time ago. It was a fantastic experience. And I found myself in a bazaar in Ahmedabad, and I needed a new backpack. And I went in, there was a guy selling bags, and I said, how much is that one there? And he said, 200 rupees. I said, I'll give you 60. He said, okay, well, special end of month deal, 160. I said, 50. He said, what? I said, 50. He said, a special deal for you, 120. I said, 40. 40? Yeah, 40. I walked out and he pulled me back in and you sold it for 40. Okay. So that's cheating the anchoring. I wasn't going to go along with it, right? And in fact, there is a book, I forget who it's by, said never meet in the middle. But anchoring is the first number you hear, or if the first thought you have about something is going to anchor and influence everything else that comes after it.
First impression lasts.
First impression, right. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. And so that's anchoring, and that's used a lot in marketing. The special deal, whatever it is, it's much less than this number here. But where does that number come from? That's anchoring. So there are those sorts of things that happen all the time. And so, in answer to your question, I think people realize that that's happening. I mean, they've been exposed to it so long, they realize it, But there's a lot of them who still think it's a good deal.
Anchoring is so powerful. There was an experiment. In this experiment, they asked random people to draw just random numbers out of a bag. One bag has high numbers, around 100. One bag has much lower numbers, around 10. And they will throw, 120, 90, etc., or 7, 10. And then they asked to estimate how much do you think this bottle of wine is worth? And as you know, bottle of wine is quite subjective because the range can be from like £5 to hundreds. And although randomly throwing numbers out of a bag and the price or the value of this bottle of wine are completely uncorrelated, the correlation and the power of anchoring was so strong. All those who had random numbers around 100, they estimated the bottle of wine to be worth around 100. And those who had numbers around 10 estimated the wine to be around £10.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's a good example of how that works unconsciously, too. So even if you're not thinking about it, you don't realize what is happening to you unless you're smart enough to listen to your program and be aware of these sorts of factors that are used every day in marketing to get people to spend money.
Do you think we would get immune to all these tactics if we become aware of them?
Yes, I think if you became more aware of them, you would be much less likely to buy in. Doesn't mean to say you wouldn't once in a while, because there'd be other factors. There may be something that, hey, you really think is a good deal, even independent of anchoring bias or what have you. But yeah, the key is awareness. That's where it starts. Awareness, that's where it starts. But that may not even be enough. Just being aware of something like that might not be enough, because we know with behavior, awareness is one thing, but you got to do something different to establish a new behavior change. So if your awareness led to you not purchasing when you might otherwise, yeah, absolutely. And people do need to be aware of the things we're discussing on this show, because they are the things that happen every day. And people make these decisions without being aware of them, without thinking of them. And sometimes they're inappropriate. And again, going back to compounding, you may have somebody who, I'm just going to buy it. It's only 10 quid, 10 pounds. Yeah, whatever. But they do that, 30 times a month. That adds up, right? So actually probably a very good thing to do would be to actually plot every expenditure, everything you put money out on in the course of a month, and review it. We live in the present. We live in the present. And so one of the big biases relevant to money is something called temporal discounting, which is the tendency to discount the future because it's in the future. We might imagine what that would be like, but we don't think about it enough and we don't feel it. We live in the present. And so that is a big driver of expenditures that maybe we shouldn't make, can't afford. We don't think about 5, 10, 15 years down the road, would I rather have this in my savings than what have you. So temporal discounting is big.
It sounds very linked to the instant versus delayed gratification. I used to see gratification as a muscle. So nowadays, everything, all the products that we use, all the advertising, all the platforms, they all push and they all train our instant gratification. That's what is stimulated. But the delayed gratifications, I see it like a muscle that needs to be trained, just like your heart or your brain or your legs if you want to run. But we forget to train it. And the result is, if we forget to train that delayed gratification muscle, we're only going to make very short-term, short-sighted decisions. I find it very scary to see that everything now is just now, like take this offer, 5 seconds left, stop thinking, stop planning your future, just do it.
Absolutely. And a couple of things come to mind there. First, there's a classic psychology experiment done by a guy called Walt Mischel at Stanford in the 1970s. And what he did, he brought elementary school kids into a room. This is called the marshmallow experiment. And they were said, you can have one marshmallow now, but if you wait a few minutes, you can have two. And then they followed those groups, the ones who were, if you want to call it, a little more impulsive and the ones who showed a little more self-control over their lifetime. And those kids who were able to delay gratification and wait and get two instead of one, their life was so much better on so many different levels: success, achievements, health, all of those things. Yeah, all of
not
those
just
things.
Money, almost every aspect that requires personal development.
Yeah, we need that self-control. We need to stop, wait a minute, and not just be pulled into a decision. Now, interestingly enough, on the concept of temporary discounting, and you might have heard of this study, people were asked about putting aside money for retirement. And one, they were just done that. Another group were actually, and we've all seen these apps where you can put your photo in and it shows you 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road. They're actually shown those apps and, look at themselves 10, 20 years later and asked to save money. And they saved a lot more money than the people who didn't look at the future like that. And that's actually a pretty cool thing because it brings that future in the present, which is otherwise difficult to do. If you look at yourself and, oh man, that's where I am when I'm 60, that's what I'm going to be like when I'm 65. Might get you to think about that instead of it's just a number, it's vague, it's an idea, it's, shapeless, it doesn't mean anything. So get yourself one of those aging apps, and before you buy anything, look at yourself 20 years from now and see whether that purchase is really a good idea.
One of the hard things is to see what's the action and what's the benefit of saying no today in the present to have a benefit maybe tomorrow, in 1 week, in 2 weeks. So for example, why is it so hard to lose weight? Because the causality between not eating the chocolate cake right now and what will be the impact on my weight is very hard to draw. Am I going to lose weight tomorrow, next week, tonight? I don't know. By how much? How would I look? It's very, very hard to draw this causality. And you certainly know that better than me, but I think the brain is not good at making causality links that are anywhere longer than a couple of hours.
No, that's exactly right. And that's exactly the same problem. You're right in bringing that up. And somebody who's worked in the addictions and weight loss and wellness fields saw that all the time. And talking about just making behavior change generally, quitting smoking. And so that then comes to being understanding of how really to get people to own the message and communicate in a way that makes that possible. For example, one of my favorite stories, early in my career, I worked on the addiction research unit in London, and I was working on the alcohol, drug side, but there was another group of people working on the smoking side. And there was this one guy who was an inveterate smoker. He just couldn't quit. And I happened to know, we all knew about him, I happened to know that he was an avid socialist. Really, this was a time when Labour Party was in power at various times. He was a socialist. And one time he was pulling cigarettes out of a machine. Those were the days when you could get cigarettes out of a machine. And as I walked past him, I just happened to be there. I said, boy, Joe, those capitalist tobacco companies have really got you by them. You know what? He never smoked again. Okay. And so, again, it's how you present that. How do you present that? If it's, if you don't quit smoking in 20 years, you're going to have lung cancer. Big deal. It's not going to resonate. Unless you take him to a cancer ward and say, this is you here, or what have you. But just that idea, devoid of anything else, no, it doesn't make people quit entrenched behaviors. It's not. It's got to be meaningful to them. They've got to feel in the present some downside of what they're doing.
That's a very key point.
which is why sometimes people have to have, some sort of physical setback for them to wake up and say, oh, you know what? I really need to quit, because now it's meaningful to them. So I have a book called Power Talk, The Art of Effective Communication, that I wrote 20 years ago because into a career in psychology, I realized nobody had taught me anything about that, which was critical, of how do you make somebody really own a message that they need to. And it isn't just telling them. It isn't telling them. If we got to the point where somebody was coming to me to quit smoking, my first question would be, why the hell do you want to quit? Because I'm sure everyone else has said, oh yeah, you need to quit because that hadn't worked. And why I think they should quit has got nothing to do with it. It's why do you want to quit, right? So the same thing is here. Why do you want to spend that money? What else could you spend it on? You could save it. Hey, in 20 years, it could be worth 100 times as much. Those are the sorts of challenges we need, but you don't get that. But you've got to train yourself to think a bit like that so that you can not be manipulated by pretty simplistic system one, automatic thinking, using confirmation bias to justify it. Oh yeah, I absolutely need this thing. Really?
For all our audience who are not familiar with the system 1 and system 2 of the brain, can you explain that in a simple way?
Yes. So one of the main contributors to this concept or the articulation of the concept of cognitive bias is a guy called Daniel Kahneman, Kahneman. His first book on this subject was called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's a really good dive into the research on cognitive bias and how it works. And really he came up with system one thinking is a better expression, intuitive. It just feels right. Yeah, I'm going to go do that. You do not spend a lot of time doing any sort of critical thinking about it at all.
He calls it the lizard brain because it's so old.
Right. It's so automatic and so forth. Now, system two thinking is really critical thinking, where you really stop and really think deeply about your actions or the issue and try to find out as much as you can and think about it. That's critical thinking. Most of the time we operate system one thinking, and one of the reasons is brain's goal is to conserve energy because survival is its main goal, and you never know from a primitive point of view when a tiger or a bear is going to jump out in front of you and you're going to have to run or fight. We still have that. We haven't moved beyond that. A lot of our stressors today are not physical stressors, but we still have a system that's geared up for that. So the brain wants to conserve energy. So, hey, I don't want to do a deep dive into this. Yeah, make a decision. Now, for a lot of things in life, that's probably pretty appropriate. What should I have for lunch? You really don't need to spend like a 30-minute critical deep dive into all the things you've had in the last 20 days and what your body's like. No, that's not necessary. But should I buy this car? Should I spend $10,000? Do I buy a house? Should I get married? All of those decisions really need a lot more thought. System two thinking. And a lot of people aren't trained in how to do that. They just aren't. And again, that's a failure, I think, of education.
I think universities should teach people how their brain is working in a very simple way. System 1, system 2. What is instant versus delayed gratification? And being able to recognize when others are trying to manipulate them by triggering only their system 1s. Everything that is just asking you to make a decision in 5 seconds, don't think, just act on your impulse. Instant gratification, it's triggering the system 1. It doesn't want you to think. It doesn't want you to analyze. It doesn't want you to make an educated decision. And I think that's a growing problem.
I know, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, to almost any offer, the answer should be, let me think about that. I'll tell you, I'll come back with that tomorrow maybe. But let me think about it. Because you're absolutely right. It's geared to that instant thinking. Don't analyze it. Don't think about it. Just go with your gut. You're going to make poor decisions.
I had this discussion with a couple of friends, and interestingly, some of them said, but what's wrong with going with your guts? What would you answer to that?
The answer to that is intuition is a complex topic and misunderstood. We are all going to feel things, either good things or bad things, based on our experiences, right? And I've worked with people who've been traumatized and what have you, and they would get this doesn't feel right, simply because it was a function of their past experiences, not got anything to do with whether something was right or wrong. One person who'd been horribly traumatized, and that had been associated with many things, when they got around a certain type of flower, they would get, oh my God. And I knew what it was. There was nothing wrong with the flowers. It was the experience. So we have to be careful. Now, there probably is some intuition that tells us, wait a minute, something's not right here for you. But what you have to work out is that rational or is that totally spurious? And that's a challenge. That's really the challenge. Is my feeling that this isn't right based on simply some experiences I've had, or am I picking up something that is useful information? And that is really a challenge, because intuition can be valuable or it can be totally spurious, depending on what you're feeling. There's some good stories about that. Lisa Barrett writes well about where emotions come from and our bodily experiences and how we interpret that. And there's a story in that book about how there's a guy she meets at work, and she suddenly feels that she's a little hot and flustered around him, and perhaps she's attracted to him, and she's not conscious of that, but she's definitely feeling excitement and whatever. And then she goes home, and overnight she develops flu, and she realizes, no, that wasn't attraction, that was the beginning of flu. Okay, because we go on that. Now, you could say, well, she should have gone with her intuition. Well, no, her feelings were nothing to do with intuition. They were coming from something else. So we do have to be careful about that. I do think there is something called intuition, subconscious understanding of something that consciously we don't get. But that may be just a function, as I say, of spurious personal experiences, or it may be something legitimate, and it's very difficult a lot of the time to work that out. And if you go with your gut, you're probably not going to work it out accurately.
I try to be very rational in my life because that's my personality. I'm an engineer. I like to analyze and deconstruct all problems. And whenever I see an ads, I don't watch TV, but they're everywhere, even now. Even if I don't want them, they come to me. I see that the way they present products and services is rarely from an objective way. I feel like they try to manipulate my emotions and try to make me feel that, oh, I would be so much more and so much happier if I had that, because look at that person. That person is so happy, so just buy it. And
right.
for me to get immune to that is to use my system too. So my analytical brain, okay, what is it trying to convey me? Do I really need to buy another jacket? I already have 3 in my cupboard that I barely use. Okay, that guy is happy, but why are they showing that to me? It sounds just irrelevant when you deconstruct and analyze it that way.
No, that's true. Absolutely. But everyone needs at least 5 jackets, and you've only got 3. And, you'd have to take a serious look at whether you aren't failing in your...
And this is the implicit narrative. If you don't have that, you're failing at your life.
Right.
Because, look, you're not as happy as this person. Look at how happy is this person.
Happy they are. Yeah.
By happiness.
Yeah, exactly. The smiling face is really... You could be as happy as that guy, who we paid to be happy for the advertisement.
If only it worked.
So,
if only there was a button.
Yeah, we have.
You pay, you push, and you're happy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We just need to be more aware of this. This sort of conversation we're having is great because hopefully people listen to it will become more aware, will realize that they do have tools just becoming more aware of that and asking themselves some legitimate questions. Am I being manipulated? Let's suppose I didn't even hear this. Would I miss it? Do I really need it? Where else would that money go? Because the one thing with money is if you spend it here, the issue is not, did I get something? But the relative value is, what else could I have done with it? Right? And that's something that, again, people don't consciously think about.
We're never trained to think that way. We're only trained to think, look what you can buy now. Be happy, be more happy. You're happy, be even happier.
And the concept of happiness there is a problem. Happiness is not just feeling good for a few seconds or a minute or two. That's not what happiness is, and people misunderstand that. In the measures of happiness of people around the world, the measure is satisfaction, meaning in their lives, purpose. That's what drives happiness, not possessions. And so there is this notion that you will be happy, as in, oh, fun, dopamine, yeah, for a few seconds maybe. But that's not happiness. That's fun, but it's not happiness.
I call it the hook, because then they sell you the first jacket. You thought you would be happy in your life, and maybe you have excitement for one day or two, and then you go back to where you were. So what do? Look, next jacket.
Well, you need another jacket.
And it works so well.
Yeah, the ultra happiness jacket. One of the things that's interesting in terms of evolution and maybe aging or whatever you want to call it, is these various stages that we go through. And people, I'm sure, are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the top of the hierarchy was self-actualization, that you made it. You got that job you wanted. You make X amount of dollars, what have you. Actually, just before he died, Maslow added something above that, which was transcendence, self-transcendence. You move beyond yourself.
Is that the level 6 of the pyramid?
Yes. So because he died, that really never got out there, and all the versions of his pyramid are pretty much the original one, not the adjusted one that he had just before his death, which is self-transcendence. When you go beyond, oh, this is great for me and I'm great, where you are actually contributing and helping other people and society in general. And that was the ultimate goal. And I think that is what happiness is about. It's not about money. You have money, potential, financial relief, no question that, not having money, very stressful, can be, depending on how you approach it.
Very stressful, I can tell you.
Yeah, it is. No,
Don't
totally.
be there. Don't be broke.
No, I agree completely. So we're not saying that, but the mistake is that financial relief is happiness. It isn't. It's relief. And happiness is really contributing in a meaningful way, in different ways. Now, if you have a lot of money, as we mentioned earlier, then that makes it easier for you to do that. You can fund things, you can donate, you can all of that stuff. But even if you don't have money, you can still be that person. Not perhaps at Bill Gates' foundation level, but you can still help that person across the street. You can still help your neighbor. You can have a mindset of, I'm connected with everyone and I want to be able to help as much as possible.
This is life-changing discovery for me, because I always learned at school when I was reading psychology books in MBA that the Maslow pyramid has 5 steps, and the ultimate one, which is what most people aspire, is self-actualization, doing what they want, becoming what they want from life. So now I just discovered that there is a 6th level. So are you saying that the purpose, the quest of happiness of everybody should be to reach that 6th level in the Maslow pyramid? And if we ever get there, then we will be happy?
Yes, I believe that is the case. I personally believe that's the case. In my book, I think, therefore, I'm wrong, I talk about cognitive biases and all these biases and how we get misled. And in reviewing and thinking about that and looking at the philosophers and the great people of the past, it's clear to me that wisdom comes from virtue, from being virtuous, from being respectful, from being humble, from being compassionate, from being loving, being kind. I really believe that. I believe if those are your foundational principles, if you're going to be biased, you're going to be biased in the right way. If those aren't your foundational principles, then you're going to be biased in a potentially harmful way. So if everything is about money, and I got to make the most money, and I got to win, your biases are going to take you off in, I personally believe, the wrong direction. Now, there's nothing against that, having money, but the question is, what do you do with it? And how do you think about it? So I do think that self-transcendence, of reaching a point where, you know what, it's not just about me, it's about everybody, is where happiness comes.
Which, interestingly, is what most people do once they become rich, or at least rich in their mind. They can't buy stuff anymore because they have too much money to possibly spend.
They got 33 jackets already. They don't need any more, right?
So we are actually doing the complete wrong thing, and we have the wrong mindset, because the entire society wants to give us the narrative that the next step for us is to buy the next thing, and will increase in our ladder of social class, of happiness, of whatever social class. But you're actually saying that we do it all wrong.
Yes. Yeah. In a way, absolutely. And you see this when people talk about economics, and that's the fundamental basis of economics. They say, oh my goodness, if we did this, this industry would be, people wouldn't be buying any more of this. Okay, that's fine. They'd have money to save or spend it on something else.
Or invest.
Right? And I understand the sort of short-term implications of that, but hey, we got to move on. When automobiles came in, people in the horse and buggy business were probably laid off, and that was the end of that business. That's part of evolution. And there's never I doubt there's ever a thing that's critical that disappears. And same thing like the trickle-down economics. Oh, well, people have got to be rich because those are the people, who spend the money and employ people. Really? I mean, if middle-class or lower-class people had those billions of dollars, they wouldn't spend it? I think they would. So, again, there's a lot of fundamental thinking about economics that I think is misleading. And I certainly think if we're talking about happiness, we're talking about purpose. We're not talking about money. Now, there's nothing wrong with having money. Personally, I think it's secondary to your main purpose, not the purpose. And I think that's one of the problems that people have when they are successful and they accumulate money. Now what? Okay, I've got 10 million, 15, 20, 25 million. So what? Now what?
It's a matter of mindset.
I'm bored. Hey, I live in a place, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. It's sort of a resort destination. It's got a lot of golf courses. And in the course of my career, I've seen people, very successful corporate executives who retired here. They come to see me and they say, oh man, I think I'm depressed, or I'm Alzheimer's or something, because I'm just not the guy I used to be. I thought playing golf every day would be great, but it isn't. No. Yeah, once in a while it'd be, but not every day. And this notion of retirement, that somehow you retire, and some of these guys were very, successful leaders of big companies. You adapt. I don't believe in retirement. I believe in rewirement, that you find other ways of manifesting yourself, of helping others. That's where you'll find your purpose and meaning. It doesn't stop because you retired.
What would you say to all our listeners who are still bombarded on a daily basis with temptation and this narrative that they need to buy more to be more, and who are trying to change their mindset?
Well, I think you just have to be aware of manipulation. You're in control. Although, as we mentioned a little before we got on, talking about the social dilemma documentary, perhaps you're less in control than you think you are, but you still have control, hopefully, over your finances. And don't be manipulated by other people and telling you what you need and what you don't need and what have you. I think you need to understand who you are, appreciate yourself, appreciate your talents. What are you giving people? What are you giving back? That's going to be your legacy. That's going to be what makes you happy. That's what's going to make you fulfilled. And you could have 500 jackets in your wardrobe, but the jackets ain't got nothing to do with happiness or your fulfillment. That comes from within. And actually, you don't need a whole lot. You don't need, if you look at all of the wise people of the past, they didn't have any possessions. Part of it because they didn't want to be lured in and tempted by that. Now, I'm not saying you go homeless and don't have possessions, but put it in perspective. Put it in perspective. It's interesting. I had a client who was married and lived a high lifestyle and had a beautiful home in a beautiful neighborhood here, very expensive, then got divorced. And I met her a few months later and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm living in this mobile home out here. I've never been happier. I've never been happier." Doesn't take things to make you happy. And we need to think about that. We need to think about how we're being manipulated. And you need to think, not just be pulled in impulsively to buy this thing or buy that. Think about it. Think about, okay, this is X pounds, dollars, whatever. What else could I do with this money? Well, you could donate it, perhaps. You could put it in a savings fund. You could buy something else. Think of the alternatives, because that's, as you rightly said, Sam, we do not do that when we're spending.
And actually, some of the richest and happiest people on earth, they don't buy stuff, not because they couldn't afford, but because they don't want to be in that game and in that mindset and in that competition of buying more and more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an illusion that can become a delusion. And that's actually, when people, we talked about lottery winners, some of them, not all of them, of course, but some of them have found didn't make a difference. Actually, it made them worse because they thought that was the answer, and it isn't.
And only bitterness
that's
comes.
Even worse in some ways. Yeah, exactly. So we need to think of money and finances as an extension of us. There are resources. How would we want to use our resources? Temporary fix, temporary high, or something long-lasting? Choice is yours, but you got to wake up and realize there's a lot of pressure you're fighting against in society and with marketing and advertising and how you've been programmed to think that the more you have, the happier you will be.
It's a trap. And the reason I have founded Nova Money is I want people to think of what they really want from life, not what the others are telling them or manipulating them to believe that's what they need to be happy. No, what do they really want? Do they want to retire early? Do they want to travel, etc.? And then plan their lives and set their financial goals so that they can get what they want and live their lives. Because if we spend our entire life working to spend what others want us to spend, we're not free. We're just being machines, and we're behaving as consumerism machines. And it works very well for the system, but it doesn't work for people because it doesn't lead to happiness.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And so when you establish those priorities, material possessions and money is not number one. Your purpose and meaning and your development and your contribution is the most important. And money is definitely not first on the list, might be second, because it certainly can facilitate a number of things. But you don't worship it. What you go after are those more important goals that Maslow realized later in his life, that this is about self-transcendence, not just self-satisfaction.
Awesome. Howard, thank you so much for all your wisdom. I hope that our listeners have learned and will take great takeaways to just spend a moment and think about their life, how they have been spending their money, and what they want to achieve, then to check, is it aligned? So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Sam. It's been great talking with you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found this episode enjoyable, inspiring, and educational. In this era of instant gratification, it is more important than ever to train our delayed gratification muscle. So keep learning, keep improving by 1% every day. You may not see the result right now, but this is a secret of all the successful people I've met. Please help me spread financial education by sharing this podcast with your friends and community. I would love it if you could also leave us a review. It really helps the show. Now, I would like you to forget about all the advertising that is being pushed to us on a daily basis and think about your personal financial goals. What do you really want to achieve with your money? If you have financial objectives, then check out the Nova Money app. Nova is an AI that will show you how to set financial goals and how to achieve them. A plan is only useful if you can follow it. That's why Nova will send you daily motivational messages to give you the strength to ignore the daily temptations of spending money and stay focused on your goals. Like other budgeting apps, Nova connects all your bank accounts in one place to give you the full picture. The difference is that the Nova AI will do all the budgeting and tracking for you. The second difference is that unlike many free personal finance apps, we don't sell users' data. All your data is encrypted and will remain completely private. Make sure that you're investing in your financial education. Make sure that you're building your financial freedom. And I'll speak to you in the next episode.